I would just make a couple of comments. The first comment is imagine what those things might be without the Chinese bureaucracy on top of them. So what China is particularly good at is making things making things thriftily, making things very cheap and commoditizing them. So this is, for example, what happened with the solar industry and why the solar industry all migrated to China and essentially, eliminated Wacker and Hemlock and REC and all the foreign companies. I mean, most of them still exist, but they're not real factors the way the massive exporters of LDK and STP and Yingli and so forth were. Where are those companies now? Dead, right? Solar has gotten a lot cheaper and it's become a Chinese dominated thing, but where are those particular companies? Dead. And where is solar innovation? Not in China, right? And the same is true of EVs and batteries. If you take away the subsidies from EVs and battery technology, then you really don't have a lot of Chinese industry. And what you do have is massive cost reduction in these technologies. So that will they be? I mean, let me give you a case that I've probably bored you with in the past, but this is when I was I was first in China, is cell phones, hand phones, right? So China got it used to be that Motorola and Nokia dominated the hand phone business. They hardly exist anymore. I think and they exist, but not in hand phones. Anyway, so China's bureaucracy was upset about this, and they wanted to change it. So they decided, okay, we're going to fund R&D for Chinese domestic cell phones, and the metric is if you export, then you're winning, right? So they did create a whole lot of, explosion in Chinese exports, and Motorola and Nokia lost their positions as number one and number two. And you got these companies like Kejian and Konka and Panda and HEC's, cell phone division, all becoming, massive exporters. But meanwhile, the LCD screen, the chipset, the software, the form factor all became technologies overseas. And Chinese manufacturers essentially imported kits from either Korea or France and then packed them into a plastic case and sold that. So they drove down the price and they got right off the technology curve. So, are they important? Yes, important, because they did export a lot of, really cheap things. Are they technologically innovative? No. So first of all, I would question, obviously Chinese companies can innovate. The great innovation is in driving down cost and arbitraging regulatory inefficiencies in order to make money, as in the example of the slaughterhouse. The second piece of it is something that Tony alluded to, which is you still have 60% of the country which has education levels lower than Algeria by international standards, health standards that are lower than Mexico, just all down the line, who are living like third world country people. And, meanwhile, you have people in Shanghai and Beijing who, have 50 times as much wealth as we do, like the average person, right? That's not right. And that's been maintained through the system of hukou, which is essentially a system of maintaining a large, cheap, backwoods labor force as if you had your own Bangladesh sitting in your backyard. So is that right? No. And is that maintained by the party? Yes.
Yeah, I think this conundrum is what makes China endlessly fascinating, and also related to what you're saying. You can't really draw a simple conclusion because it is such a mix of different things happening at the same time. I thought, on your question, this relates, I think, to Anne's point. Yasheng Huang, I think, has written very well on this, about what he talks about, kind of the outsourcing for innovation, whether it's bringing foreign companies into China, whether it's sending your people overseas to study, bringing that technology and knowledge back, which is where a lot of these tech companies originally developed from. And then what you give them is you give them scale. You then give them a market of 1.4 billion, and you put protective walls around them so they don't, they're not competing with other global companies in those areas. And that's what has driven, I think, a lot of that kind of success. Then it raises the interesting question if, as is happening increasingly, and I think will continue under a Trump presidency, if China gets more and more isolated in terms of being able to engage globally around forefront technologies, can it really keep that lead, and can it have sufficient innovation within country? Now, some areas I think is doing that. Some of the areas in the platform economies, yes, it does seem to be. But as far as I can see, and it's not my area, genuinely breakthrough new technologies have not happened in China. They've often been kind of iterations of it, applications of it, scaling of it, but not the actual breakthrough technology itself.
Yeah, and it's really clear why. I mean, in the early 2000s, I got so that if people would invite me to talk about Chinese, domestic, what would they call it? Domestic innovation? Anyway, whatever word they had for that. I felt like I would much rather have a root canal. It's just like, yes, obviously Chinese people are inventive and Chinese people invent fascinating things, but, the bureaucracy, most, for example, which used to be in charge is kind of half in charge of under Jiang Zemin, it was very much in charge of tactical, targets, had a list on its website until it became unpopular to do that, of technologies that you should replicate in order to get subsidies. So, the Pentium 2 chip and the, whatever, chip for a set-top box. And so what you had is you had Chinese companies competing to redo these technologies 2 to 5 years late. So they wouldn't have a market compared with the world leader, which had already moved on, but they could make them 40% cheaper. So along with subsidies, they could sell them in the countryside. So this is the story of, for example, of Haier. This is what, a lot of what Haier did in its research institutes. It's part of what Lenovo did before Lenovo, hooked onto IBM and broke free. Is it a useful thing to do? I mean, yeah, you can sell an awful lot of HEC phones in Nigeria, but is it really innovative? No. And also, does it increase total factor productivity? No. And I think if you look at those numbers, you'll see they've gone backwards recently.